Hey everybody, welcome to Make the Pod by Talking. If you got questions, email us at wemakethepodbytalking@gmail.com. We're available on Anchor, Spotify, and SoundCloud. And I'm Takashi, I'm one of the co-hosts, and we have Carlos and George today.
Hi everybody, I'm Carlos. I'm a linguistics PhD at the University of Chicago, and I'm currently based in Central California. I'm from Central California.
Hi everyone, my name is George. I'm a video game developer and I live in Los Angeles.
All right, thanks for joining us, George.
I know. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I know that today's topic is kind of I guess it's not something we usually talk about. And I'll be honest, I'm not really knowledgeable on this. And Carlos, I don't know how much you know about the topic as much either. And George, I know you're not necessarily like a PhD on China history or like Chinese culture. So I feel like this is just a conversation. We're just letting the listeners know we're not necessarily experts on like China or like, you know, the history of China or the culture of China. This is just going to be based on our observation experiences, what we read, and our opinions too. So I know the topic was about misconception about China and the mainstream American propaganda. We can just start off. I guess, George, I know that you live in China. Mm-hmm. What are some of the misconceptions about China that the Americans typically may have?
Okay, I think the first one is a lot of Americans think that in China people have no say in what happens in the government. Like they think it's a complete dictatorship. And then when you ask them, you know, like, oh, how does China elect leaders? They just say like, oh, the government just chooses someone, you know, like randomly. But that process actually involves the people a lot more than people think. So the first layer of government, you know, like the local leaders, they're actually elected by the people, by like regular citizens. And then after those local leaders are elected, leaders above them, which would be regional leaders, they are elected by those local leaders. So everyone is chosen by their, I guess, like subordinates. Yeah, like, and then if a leader goes like off the chain or something, the subordinates have the power to remove the leader. Another thing, local leaders, after they're elected, the government surveys the people after about a year. And then if the people are mostly negative on that new leader, then the government removes that new leader. So in China, the election process is different, but the people don't actually have no power at all, like what people believe here. It's just the election process is different. Yeah, and then further up the chain, the governors of the provinces will elect the chairman. And then if the chairman goes off the chain, the governors can remove the chairman from power. Yeah, so it's more of like the process is less about campaigning, because most of the elections are done throughout the government, except for the very bottom level. So there's less campaigning, and it's the China's way of choosing leaders is more about just trying out a leader, and after a year seeing how that leader is, and then basically essentially grading them on their results, and then removing them if they're not good enough, or keeping them around if they're good. It's not as much about campaigning, but the citizens actually do have a big voice. Yeah, I would actually argue that it's easier to remove a leader that the people don't like from power in China than in America. It might be harder to remove like the top like chairman, but like local leaders, it's much easier because the government does annual surveys, and then if the results show negative, then they remove the leader from power. And then another thing people think is they say like, another misconception is that people think that Chinese citizens live in fear of the government, but that's completely untrue. I actually think people in America are more afraid of the police and the government than the citizens in China are. For one, cops in China don't carry guns. So what you see is like, you know, I remember when I went to China, for the first time ever in my life, I saw people actually arguing with the police. And it was just so shocking to me. Like, how are they brave enough to argue with the police? Like, they're not worried they're going to get shot or arrested, But yeah, like because the cops don't carry guns. Yeah, they say like China's government doesn't care about human rights, but then if someone goes crazy and like is in the streets wielding a knife, the cops actually get riot shields and disarm the person rather than shooting the person. Although like I don't really think, okay, if someone is in America's charging at a police officer with a knife, I think it's okay for the cop to shoot them. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I'm just saying like if they were completely inhumane and didn't care about people, they wouldn't go through the trouble of disarming the person. They would just shoot the person. And then another thing is protests can actually happen in China. The only type of protests that are illegal are ones where you destroy property or where you try to overthrow the government. Basically, there was like a few well-known ones last year. One of them was the government wanted to build a landfill somewhere, but the residents near that city felt like the landfill was too close to their homes. So they gathered up and they had picket signs and everything. They protested, and then the government removed the landfill and didn't build it. But yeah, people actually don't get shot when they protest.
No, you put it on mute.
You on mute?
Yeah,
Okay.
sometimes I'll have it on mute. But I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
Which was, what part of China did you live in?
So the longest I've ever stayed at one time, because I would go like every year for like during the summer. So the longest I've ever stayed is 3 months in Shanghai. But I've in short, like for weeks at a time, not months at a time, I've stayed in Canton, in the capital of Canton, Guangzhou. I've stayed in Chengdu, which is the capital of Sichuan. But most of my time I've spent in China was in, most of the time I spent in mainland China was in Shanghai. I spent whole summers there and everything. And then a lot of my time was also spent in Hong Kong.
Was there anything else you wanted to talk about? Because I know you said you wanted to mention something else. Like any other misconception that Americans might have about China.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. I also want to talk about another thing that people don't know about is I don't know if any country did this before China, but China kind of invented what I call commune capitalism. But I don't know. Do you guys know? Has any country like combined capitalism and communism before?
I mean, like Vietnam has done it, but I think that's after China.
Oh, okay. But essentially, after after the Civil War, China was full on communist, and then there was a lot of mismanagement of resources, and there was a lot of starvation, which is why you get a mixed opinion on Mao. And then later on, after China had reform, Deng Xiaoping opened up China a little more, and then Xi Jinping, in my opinion, he truly brought about commune capitalism, which is commune capital. Like basically, people that like capitalism, they say capitalism is the answer to feudalism's problems, and then people who like socialism say socialism is the answer to capitalism's problems. And then I think commune capitalism is the answer to both capitalist problems and socialist problems. And what it essentially is I don't know if this is the actual term, if I just made it up, but essentially commune capitalism is where the government acknowledges that both capitalism and communism used together can make society better. And at the core, the government remains communist, but allows capitalism to exist in its economy. Why I think commune capitalism is important is because, for example, let's say we're talking about like clothing or anything that requires a lot of innovation. Even if we're talking about like medicine or technology, there needs to be capitalism involved in there because capitalism encourages creativity. But if capitalism, if your education is capitalist, if all of your real estate is capitalist, if all of your health insurance is capitalist, then everyone gets screwed. That doesn't lead to the best outcome for the country. And we're seeing that in America today. We're seeing that we're seeing that going on in Hong Kong today. Yeah, we could get to that. We could talk about Hong Kong after, because I think Hong Kong is more affected by late stage capitalism than America is. But essentially, commune capitalism is where the government green lights when capitalism can exist and then pulls the plug when it's going too far. But since it's a necessary tool, the government allows it. So one example is like real estate in China. You have to have what we call a hukou, which means like, so in China, your ID also says what city you belong to, your identification in China. And then normal citizens can only buy houses in the city that they belong to. And then there's a restriction on how many houses they can buy. And then I believe, I heard from my Vietnamese friend that Vietnam does this too. But it's one of the core principles of communism that I like. That at first, when it first got implemented, Chinese people weren't happy with it because their land was being taken away. But I understand that, and I think it makes a lot of sense because the way I see it is, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're innovating an industry and bringing improvements to society, then I think it's okay for you to make a lot of money. But if you're just buying land and not building more land, just rebuying used land and just buying a bunch of stuff and just investing and not really providing innovations, it's harmful to allow people to become billionaires through that process. So that's why I really, that's one of the things that, that's one of the core principles behind communism, is to not allow people to just buy, because communism hates land ownership. People will say, oh, the reason you can't own land in China and Vietnam, you actually have to rent the land from the government for like, depending on where it is, it could be like 50 to 100 years. And then when that time is up, you just re-rent it again. But people think that, oh, it's because the government doesn't want you to have any control. They want to have all control. And that is partially true. The government does keep a lot of autocratic control. But as a result, people don't really get pushed out of their communities as much. Another thing that's going on with communist capitalism in China is China has like the what I think is one of the most successful cases of poverty relief and housing projects ever. The only country I could think of that is comparable so far, I think, is maybe Singapore, because their housing subsidizing like programs are really good. But they are a lot smaller than China. So in China, what happens, the government goes to the countryside and then essentially builds new properties and then moves the citizens into those new properties, and then they provide free education to those people that are living there. And then through that education, they integrate the countryside people into city life. So it's kind of like gentrification, but without pushing people out. They're essentially giving people a boost. And then the one big thing that I think China does differently from America, because America has tried housing projects, but most of them didn't go that well, is that China provides education for those people and like puts more emphasis to integrate them into city life. So then you see, and the fact that mainland Chinese have such a reputation for being rude overseas, I think is a testament to this, because a lot of those mainlanders, they were lifted out of poverty within one generation. So they didn't have the time to learn city manners. That's why mainlanders are perceived as so rude when they go overseas, because they literally just got out of poverty and didn't learn city manners like within one generation. And then also in China, like another way that rising out of poverty becomes easier because of the government is that public transportation is super abundant, and then healthcare is universal. In China, you never have to own a car. You can take any subway to essentially anywhere, and then all those subways connect to the high-speed rail, which can take you to any city. So you don't have to be able to afford a plane ticket to travel. You don't have to be able to have a car. Most people don't have a car. I never had a car when I was there, but I could get anywhere. There is the capitalist dream of, and I don't think either one works perfectly. There's the capitalist dream of achieving economic efficiency for the citizens, and there's the communist dream of achieving economic efficiency for the citizens. And I don't think either one by itself works perfectly. But the capitalist way of creating innovation for a society is where, the theory behind this, everyone competes against each other. And then in that competition, you have to innovate and then lower prices, and you compete. And then the best product comes out, and then for the cheapest price. And then, and that's how society innovates. And then the communist dream of innovation is no one has to worry about food, healthcare, or education, because it's all provided to you. So everyone just focuses on innovation together. And then, the theory behind both of them can lead to the same outcome. But then, in my view, and I'm just speaking ideological, I'm not talking about real implementation, because I don't think either way is truly possible, but by themselves. But under the communist way, I see it more as you collaborate. And then the capitalist way is you innovate by fighting each other, fighting amongst yourselves. And that's why I think commune capitalism is the answer to a lot of the problems we have in America today, or even an answer to a lot of like pure communist countries too. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. Do you have any thoughts or questions?
I just thought that was a very interesting take. Thank you for that description. I thought it was interesting because you were explaining how basically it's the government mostly operates in in terms of the communist ideology, except in this particular domain of the economy where the idea is to, like you said, have intellectuals or entrepreneurs compete to develop like a good product, and that sort of determines, like, usually I guess the most innovative thing will be like pretty good, and like that usually determines like the progress for, like, I guess that civilization or country or community. And it seems like you were making this really interesting distinction between that and other ways by which like entrepreneurs profit, which is not by innovating, but just kind of like by hoarding, by like like basically by just hoarding like goods, like hoarding like things that people need, like land, like land, or, and I could imagine like other domains where that happens, like I guess with like maybe even farmers like could do that too, like with food, hoard food and stuff.
So, definitely in healthcare, like with health insurance.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know. I thought that was an interesting take, because I'd never really thought of it that way. I've always heard about that, how China kind of merges communism and capitalism, but I was never sure like how that merging worked.
The founder of Huawei, he actually embodies this philosophy, and I think it's one of the reasons why Trump fears, or a lot of the Republicans in America will fear Huawei so much, is because he really embodies this mindset. So basically, he's the owner of the biggest telecommunications company in the world, but his net worth is only $1.5 billion. And that's not a lot if you compare him to like the founder of Uber, which is a much smaller company than Huawei. He's already worth like 15 billion. The owner of much smaller companies are worth way more than him. And the reason is he decided not to IPO his company. So he didn't take it public because he didn't want capitalism to get control of his company. Because Huawei actually means for Chinese, for the Chinese people. But yeah, that's his philosophy. So instead of IPOing his company, he gave shares of his company to all his employees. That's like kind of an embodiment of a communist businessman, or like a communist business leader.
I've heard of other Chinese businessmen doing something similar. I remember a long time ago reading about the CEO or the owner of what was it called? They make ThinkPads. They make the
Lenovo.
Lenovo,
right?
because Lenovo is also a Chinese company, and like I think they had they made like a lot of profits one year, and so like the company owner or CEO, he basically like gave everyone a raise or something like that.
That stuff is actually pretty common, and that stuff, I think the reason it's common is not even because of the people or the culture, it's because of the government, directly because of the government. Because my dad, he, for about 30 years of his life, he ran business manufacturing companies in China. And then, so he would do clothing, but he would do the manufacturing side of clothing. So he had factories in China. And then he said, so this is like important thing, because a lot of people, they say, the first thing you hear from a lot of business people who don't like doing business in China, they'll say like, man, the government's all in my business. Like they keep sticking their nose in everything, right? But the thing is, when my dad actually told me what questions the government was asking him, that's when I, became a huge fan of the government. Is because he said every time the government would always come and randomly just essentially audit, they would always ask, what is your average pay for your employees? How many days are they getting off per year? Like everything was about the workers. And then he said whenever there will be like a lawsuit between some employees and his company, he said his company would always lose because the communist government always sides with the workers. So like, I mean, like I feel like we do have some human rights, like it's not like the government only cares about itself. But I think in the end of the day, the government cares a lot about the workers.
It's like a giant multi-trade union. Wow, that's
Yeah.
like that's
Yeah.
that's crazy.
Earlier when I said I think Hong Kong is closer to the end stage of its capitalist cycle than America is because essentially what happened in Hong Kong was during the handover when the British handed Hong Kong back to China, England sold all of Hong Kong's real estate to essentially three corporations, English and Hong Kong corporations. And then so all the land is owned by like essentially three corporations. And then Hong Kong has really, really low tax. I think the maximum income tax percentage is probably somewhere around Singapore. It's probably around 8%. So the government doesn't really make that much money off of tax. And the way the government mainly makes money is by trying to expand new land and then selling it and then using that to run essentially its social security programs. But the thing is, Hong Kong's run out of land. And all the existing land is owned by those three corporations. The young people in Hong Kong, none of them can afford to buy a house. Most of them can't even afford rent. And then they can't find good jobs. Kind of like what's going on in America, but it's even closer to the end of the cycle. It's even worse there in Hong Kong. So I think that that's the reason why a lot of the young people in Hong Kong are so sensitive to essentially like manipulation by Trump. Like why it's so easy for American media to manipulate them is because they're in a state where they can't find jobs, they can't make a living. And then during times like those, it's easier for people to get riled up. But, in my opinion, I don't think Western democratic capitalism is going to save them at this point, because I think they're at the end stage of that cycle. I think they're going to need either communism or some form of socialism to save them at this point. And maybe even land ownership reform or something, because it can't continue in this way. Yeah, actually, my dad actually lives in Hong Kong. Usually when I go back to China, I go back to mainland to live. And then for about like 1 week, I'll stay with him in Hong Kong. So I actually see Hong Kong a lot. But yeah, I think Hong Kong is a victim of late stage capitalism. Because if we're talking about pure capitalism and pure communism, I think that early stage capitalism can be pleasant, but late stage capitalism is horrible towards the end of the cycle. I think that's because, then everyone's fighting over resources and only a few people have it. So a lot of times in really late stage capitalism, revolution is necessary. Pure communism, early stage sucks. Like it's just terrible. But then late stage pure communism, we've never seen a country make it to late stage pure communism and thrive. But the closest thing we see today, I would think on a big scale, is China. But it's not pure communist, it's commune capitalist. But I think China's going to be the same way that, like, my opinion of why we hear so much about democratic capitalism working in so many countries I don't believe it's because the system is better. I believe it's because America found a way to succeed for some of its citizens using that system. So America became kind of like a guide for other countries, and other countries could just follow them. Either follow America's way or you get attacked or sanctioned. But basically, America kind of did some of the dirty work, and other countries just had to just copy. And that's what I think will happen in the next century. China will be the example for commune capitalism, and a lot of countries will shift over and become commune capitalists. And then if China is the number one superpower, America will have a harder time interfering with countries that start to go a little bit commune capitalist. So I think in the next century, we'll see a lot more commune capitalist countries.
So you were saying you were mentioning how in Hong Kong, you were sort of explaining the turmoil is due to like these people, a lot of the youth there, they don't have jobs, and they're sort of influenced a lot by Western media. And you're also suggesting that the solution for like their problems right now would actually be more integration into the system that China has already set. and
Yeah.
yet they're sort of resisting that. Why would you? How would you explain their resistance? Like, why are they
Well,
resisting China?
I think the resistance isn't as big as what the West makes it out to be, because so there's about, is it 7 million people in Hong Kong, and then 3 million. There's 3 million people that signed a petition for more integration into China, national security laws, because they're tired of the protesters. But then, we don't really see news about that in America. And then there's also pro-China rallies that happen in Hong Kong, but we also don't see about that. We also don't see that in Western media. So, well, the older people in Hong Kong, they say that the youth, oh, it's because they never tried raising a family, so then they're willing to die for their ideals and aren't worried about, but obviously, like, not one side is truly 100% right. And then the young people will say, like, the older people don't care about freedom or all that stuff. But then I would say Hong Kong is more split down the middle. There's a group that wants to become independent, and there's a group that wants to become more integrated with China. Generally, the group that wants to become more integrated with China, they're usually older, 40 and up. And then the group that wants to become independent, most of them are comprised of people who studied abroad in the West, or just younger people. I think they worry a lot about freedom of speech. But the thing is, I think freedom of speech, like, I think it could be nice, but I don't think freedom of speech guarantees that you will be free in a country. Because I think, like, if we look at America, I feel like, you can make a case that people in America aren't truly free. That, like, this is what I don't like about democratic capitalism, and this is why I prefer communist capitalism, is because at the end of the day, I believe in democratic capitalism. Corporations will get their hands in the government, and they will essentially run the government. And the reason why I think that is because elections under a democracy is, they're done through campaigns, and then they need funding, and then it's kind of like, for lack of a better word, kind of like a popularity contest. You don't really see how good of a job the leader is going to do first. You just hear what they say, and then you have to elect them based on that. And then if corporations are already the best at marketing, so they're going to be the best at convincing people to go with their candidate too. Yeah, so that's why I think a lot of the young people in Hong Kong, they think that system will work well, but I don't agree with them. I don't think that system will work out better, because actually, what a lot of young people in Hong Kong don't know is when England ruled Hong Kong, there was no public elections, there was no democracy. It wasn't until the handover. So their way of life that they're referring to, which is being changed, that way of life only existed for about 20 years. About 20 years. So for most of Hong Kong's history, it actually wasn't even a democracy. A lot of them like the ability to vote and freedom of speech, but I don't think that is a system that will work the best for everybody. It depends on the society, the culture, the people, and those type of systems can make a country vulnerable to a corporation, because either you have, if not done well, a democracy, like I said, corporation will run the democracy. So either you have a corporation which is guaranteed to just care about profits in the end, especially after the founder leaves the company. Either you have that running a country, or you have government running a country. And the government can be corrupt or can be clean, but a lifeless corporation after the founder is already left, after it's already IPO'd, is guaranteed to only care about profits.
I was also thinking too that, like, I see a lot of Asian American activists, mostly in online spaces. They do support the Hong Kong protests, but without necessarily like analyzing or criticizing like the Western, like, mainstream propaganda. And we could kind of veer off into that, because I know part of this conversation is about the mainstream American propaganda. I guess this question to both of you, or all of us, in your opinion, why is the United States creating this form of propaganda? Because even when, like, I see this in the liberal mainstream media too, like in New York Times or like NPR, there's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment. And especially when the coronavirus came out, even before that, there was a lot of coverage about the Hong Kong protests, but barely no coverage of other protests that were happening in other countries like France, Venezuela, Iran, India. There were so many other protests happening in the world, but like so much of the coverage about the protests were only focused on Hong Kong. And even like the Republican Party and Trump administration has, publicly stated that they were in support of the Hong Kong protests. And I think like a month ago, I saw this like Twitter post by this white Christian reverend, like a church person. And, he was supporting the Hong Kong protests like a couple months ago. But when the Black Lives Matter protest happened like a month ago or recently, he was denouncing them as like looters and look at all these violent people in our country. Like, what the hell are they doing? So there's like this weird disparity that Americans want to support like the Hong Kong people, but yet they're not wanting to support the Black Lives Matter protesters.
Oh yeah, what's ironic about what that guy's posting is that if you look at the injuries that police or citizens sustained in the Hong Kong protests, it's a lot worse than the injuries inflicted during the American protests or the Black Lives Matter ones. Like the Hong Kong protesters have actually killed people before. There's one incident where there's a street sweeper who, his job is to sweep the streets, and then the protesters wanted to block off an area, but he wanted to keep sweeping, so they threw a brick at his head and then killed him. And then also, like there's a lot of instances where they shoot bows and arrows at cops, or they'll stab cops. But you don't see any of that. I mean, I don't know. I haven't heard of any cops getting killed by the protesters in America. Yeah, it's just ironic that guy would. I mean, it's not really ironic if you consider like how America and China are enemies. I would say that the two protests are different. Like, I think the Hong Kong protest is a lot more violent than the American ones. Wait, your question was, why do we think we're covering it, right? Why do you think America's covering it? I would say it's because of the trade war, because Trump wants to have leverage against China in the trade war. And I think that's the same reason why they arrested the Huawei CFO, the daughter of the founder of Huawei.
Yeah, I was just gonna piggyback off that. I think it's about the trade war, and then regarding other countries, like it's totally about like trade interests. What I was reading about more during that time were the protests in Bolivia, in which there was Bolivia until last year had a very socialist government led by Evo Morales, who was like their most leftist president in a while.
He was also part indigenous, right?
Yeah, he's part indigenous, but he was very popular. Like, that was the big thing about him. He was super popular. He was every time he ran, he got like 60% of the vote, and he was problematic in the sense that his administration did try to have him campaign for terms beyond the number he was supposed to have. He was only supposed to have 2 terms, but then they changed the constitution to give him a third, like the whole constitution to give him a third one. Mm-hmm. Then they kind of changed it again to give him a 4th one. So like people have accused him of corruption, but that hasn't changed the fact that he's like hugely popular. So last year what happened was finally there was a big right-wing movement to kind of oust him. And which was successful, which was actually like successful. And so now there's an interim government until the next elections occur. But after he was ousted, then there was sort of this like counter revolution where like all his supporters like came in, and there was like a lot of like fighting. Basically, there was almost like a civil war. It was kind of crazy. There were deaths because it was really stupid. During the right-wing protests, like the police basically stood down. That's when he stepped down basically when the law enforcement decided not to enforce like any protections for him. And that probably happened because, they got paid off or whatever. And then when there was the leftist counter demonstrations, that's when they started acting again. So there was totally like money involved, and a lot of people. So a lot of there's a lot of discussion online that the original right wing protests were basically like funded by maybe the U.S. Or just
Yeah.
whatever international interests they are, because I think it had to do with uranium. I think like Bolivia has like a lot of like it has like a lot of natural resources because it's like mountainous, and so there's a lot of mining in the area. So the conspiracy theory is that like there's like the right wing government. If the right wing government came into power, then like they would be able to like make that available to U.S. interests. And it is actually telling. Like there's some evidence for that too, because right after the right wing government, the right wing interim government came into power, that's when they opened up the country to the U.S. and Israel. Like they basically what did they do? They basically made it so that you don't need a visa to enter the country if you're from the U.S. or Israel. If you have an Israeli or U.S. passport, then you could enter the country without a visa. So they lowered restrictions for like travel from those countries. So So that's what I was reading about more during that time. And yeah, there was no coverage at all of like the left wing popular response to the presidential ouster. There was a little bit of coverage when the right wing protesters were demonstrating, but then after that, like after you had like the leftists come in, then there was no coverage. Yeah, so that's total, like that's the example that comes to mind for me, like because that's what I was reading about more.
Yeah.
But,
Oh no, sorry. Oh no, I was just thinking too when you mentioned that, because historically there's been a lot of CIA operation in Latin America and Africa.
Yeah.
Just in third world countries, like in Chile, right? Like in 1973, Salvador Allende was taken down by Pinochet. You know, the left-wing government was taken over by the right-wing government that was sponsored by the CIA.
And they also America tried to kill Castro like 200 times or something.
Yeah,
like they had like 200 assassination attempts on him or something.
Yeah, Castro's man.
He's a beast.
He is.
For surviving all that.
I mean, he passed away, but he didn't die from the Americans, or at least I don't think he did.
Yeah.
But even like countries in Africa too, like Burkina Faso had a very socialist and communist Marxist leader, Thomas Sankara, at that time. And he was only in leader for 4 years, but within those 4 years, he made so much change for the country. He did so much for the people, like irrigation systems, public healthcare, public housing. But, the American-sponsored right-wing government took over and pretty much assassinated him. So anything that's kind of pro-communist, like anti-imperialist, just gets taken out by the CIA or, the American military really quickly.
Yeah, and another thing that you don't hear about much in America is when they go communist, generally, I mean, this has pretty much happened in every country that's went communist. Their education improves, and then it becomes safer. But there's a trade-off to being safer. You have less freedom, but as a trade-off, it becomes safer. But they never show that side where the streets become safer, when it goes communist. But yeah, every single like Americans always point to all the failed communist states of the past. Well, that's because America interfered with every single one of them. So. You have to show me one that hasn't been sanctioned or interfered with, and then you can say they truly failed because of communism.
Were there any other questions you had, Carlos? Because I know there's like a long list of questions. I don't know if we'll get through all of it.
Yeah, we probably won't get through all of it. But I was kind of curious about George, your sort of attitudes with other controversies regarding the China and the representation of China in the media. Like how much of it is true in your opinion? Going beyond Hong Kong and into like autonomous regions.
Yeah.
because before Hong Kong there was the Free Tibet movement.
Yeah.
I actually remember like years ago meeting like Free Tibet people who
Mhm.
are like usually like hippies or whatever. I don't know. It's kind of funny.
Are they Tibetans or are they like?
No, they're just like white people from like
Oh,
the Midwest.
oh my
They're-
God.
and they're like, we need to free Tibet. Yeah.
So
And I mean, I was like very neutral about that because I didn't know
yeah,
much about Tibet, but yeah, there's I mean that's I think the Free Tibet movement was like the pre Hong Kong protest
yeah.
thing that's going on now.
I actually know more about the Tibet stuff than I don't know much about the Uyghur stuff, but I know more
Okay.
about the Tibet stuff. So I could, yeah, I really don't really know much about what is going on in Xinjiang with Uyghurs. But with Tibet, so basically, think okay. Another misconception I talked about before is because of what's going on with Xinjiang and what's going on with Tibet, people assume that China's Communist Party is super like kind of like a big colonizing force. But what actually happened is China's Communist Party didn't colonize those two places. They were colonized during the Qing Dynasty about 200 years ago. And then the reason the Qing Dynasty, so, those are two separate governments. After the Qing Dynasty, there was the Nationalist Party, which fled to Taiwan after the Civil War. And then now there's the Communist Party. But the reason the Qing Dynasty colonized Tibet was because, so in 1700 or 1800, when England had control of India, we hear about this in the history books all the time. England, their main goal was to take over China. That's why they smuggled in opium into the east coast of China. Their main goal was to make China open up and then essentially colonize it. So what they wanted, since India was the border of Tibet and England was in control of India at the time, England wanted to colonize Tibet, and then Tibet has a lot of mountains, so there's a lot of high ground, so it's a strategical advantage in war. So they wanted to use Tibet to take over the rest of China after, and then that's why the Qing Dynasty went and took Tibet first. Personally, I don't like the previous government in Tibet before the Communist Party, because the Dalai Lama, they used slavery, and then the slavery wasn't ended until the Communist Party got involved. But yeah, it was the Qing Dynasty that colonized Tibet, and then with their reasoning, I understand if a Tibetan has a problem with China. That perfectly makes sense. Like, I have no problem with an actual Tibetan complaining about China. But when Americans or English people complain about that, well, they kind of forced the Qing Dynasty to go and take Tibet, So like, it doesn't really make sense if people in England are complaining about the issue with Tibet. But yeah, I think what is happening in Tibet is there is an invasion of privacy, and people's ways of life are being uplifted. I mean, being forcibly changed. But there's a benefit too. Like I said, slavery was ended, and then they're provided with education and more opportunities than were before. But there is a negative. It's not all positive because, like I said, their culture is being forcibly changed. Yeah, but just my stance is I don't know like whether or not I think it's right or wrong, but definitely don't think America should complain about that. America or England. It's fine as Tibetans do.
Yeah, that's a good point. And like what you said too, Carlos, a lot of people that I met about preaching about the Free Tibet were random white dudes.
Yeah, because
Like
also it would be under English control today if it was like if the Qing Dynasty didn't go in, then England would have just taken it over, and they probably would have taken like half of China too.
Yeah, and then I took so at the University of Chicago, I took like a 1/4 of a Tibetan class, and it was actually taught by a Tibetan guy, and I learned a lot about I learned a lot about Tibet through that class, and it's funny because most of the other students in the class, they're just into Buddhism, or they're in the Free Tibet movement. So yeah, but yeah, no, it was interesting also to learn that like the Tibetans themselves, they're like in different tribes, and there's some like in Qinghai, I think
Mhm.
it's Qinghai that are they're actually like pro-China. They're
Uh-huh.
actually like very pro-China there because I think the ones in Qinghai are actually like enemies or like they're traditional enemies with the one in like actual Tibet, like in
Oh, I
Lhasa
see.
too. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I did hear about how like some Tibetans get the longer side of the stick than other Tibetans. So like it's yeah, I heard about that too.
I guess I know, George. You said you don't know too much about the Uyghurs
Yeah.
that's going on
Mhm.
in that the
And Xinjiang.
Xinjiang area. What I
That's the other big news now, because like so
Mhm.
I shared an article with Takeshi today, and it's actually a story that's being reported a lot like by different news outlets, which is like sterilization in Xinjiang.
Uh-huh.
I don't necessarily believe like that it's a true story. Like
Yeah.
it could be propaganda, but that's definitely another example too of like news that you get that is supposed to put China in a bad light, just like the previously with like the Hong Kong story, and now like there's all this focus on like Xinjiang now.
Yeah.
I think I even heard that Trump said something
Yeah, he
about it.
did. He said when he met with Xi Jinping, he said, "Oh, it's a good idea to put all your Muslims in a camp." But the thing is, there's actually like a lot of minorities in China that are Muslim. Like Hui people are all Muslims, and their area like there's more Hui people than Hans. It's like all Hui people, and the government's okay with them. It's not like a attack all Muslims type of thing, like what Trump is saying. But yeah, he actually said like, oh yeah, it's a good idea putting all your Muslims in a camp. He actually said that. It's in that guy's book, the one that worked for Trump. You guys know what I'm talking about? There's this guy who worked for Trump, and he either he was fired or he
Oh,
left, and he wrote a book.
John Bolton.
Yeah, John Bolton. Yeah,
He was like he was like fired. I forget.
yeah,
Yeah, and then he decided to write a book, and now he's being like I don't know.
yeah. And what's actually pretty funny is that now a lot of locals in China are saying is that they think the government in China actually wants Trump to win because they believe Trump will bring the downfall of the American empire faster. So that's like how lame Trump is. Like essentially he's trying to punch China in the face, but China's just laughing at me like, you're so bad at it that like just punch me again. And like I want you to stay in power because you're so bad at antagonizing me. You're just making everyone hate you and you're just destroying your own country. Like that's it's kind of like funny. I feel like it'll be like a comedy sketch in a show or something, but it's real life.
in regards to the Uyghur, it's kind of interesting that like a lot of mainstream American media is reporting it, and also people are just starting to like talk about it and just kind of putting the blame game on China. When even in this country, in the U.S., we did a lot of horrible stuff to the Muslim Americans here, like after 9/11. There was a lot of that going on, and I don't know. I just feel like it's like Americans tend to project a lot of stuff onto China, like the stuff that we kind of held belief in, or historically we kind of the oppression or the discrimination that we have done, we just kind of project it onto other countries like China. And part of me thinks like, do Americans really even care about the Uyghur people? They just
They
recently found out
yeah.
about it. And is it like, do they really care about them because they look more white? I don't know.
Yeah. Also, another interesting thing. Well, I know this about. So actually, there were some bombings in Beijing and in Kunming, where our ancestry goes back to in China. Because in Xinjiang, there's a growing radical religious extremist presence, and then sometimes ISIS would go there to recruit people, or hide out in Xinjiang. So this reform camp was in response to one of the bombings that happened in Beijing. But yeah, I don't know if they'll show that over here. But I also know that like not all. It's like what you said with the Tibetans. There's some like Uyghurs that like are in different groups. So then not all Uyghurs are like getting the same treatment. Like some are more aligned with China, and then some are less. I know that the population of Uyghurs in Xinjiang is 23 million, Yeah, I don't know how many of them are in those camps or how big they are. But I would imagine it's pretty hard to fit 23 million people into camps. I don't know. But
Yeah.
China built hospital in 8 days, so I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
Anything is possible there.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. And speaking of camps, we have our own concentration camps too, with the Central American children. I think they were just released recently. I read that on the news.
And we have internment camps too.
Yeah. Yeah, the Japanese American internment camp, Guantanamo Bay. The prison system.
And for sterilizations.
Yeah,
too,
that's
of like
true.
minorities,
indigenous people, even in Canada too.
Yeah.
Wait, so how are they sterilizing people? Like, are they like, like, what are they doing?
I think, well, you're talking about the China or the US?
Or just how do people do that in general?
I think my understanding from what I read is just they go to the doctors and the doctors would sterilize them without the patients letting them know.
Oh, like chemically sterilize.
Yeah, they would inject them with something and then just say like, like, okay, this is to make you feel better or something, or to numb this part, when it's actually like some kind of chemical sterilizer.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of that
really
with the Black and Latino and indigenous people in the United States and also in Canada too.
Oh, actually, this is weird. This is interesting because when I heard about this, I was shocked because I feel like this wouldn't happen in America. Several decades ago, when China was trying to deal with the tension between Hans and Uyghurs in Xinjiang, they offered a program where if Hans and Uyghurs got married, they would get subsidized by the government and get monthly checks to intermarry. Now, I thought that was so interesting. I've never heard of that happening like here in America. I feel like you would get a subsidy not to intermarry. It's just interesting how things work differently in different countries. I think the main thing for me was just that I wanted the viewers to hear about was the concept of commune capitalism, which I think is like essentially it's going to be the dominant form of government throughout the world. Like a lot of countries are going to start doing it over the next century. And then also the election system in China, how there actually is an election process is just different than what it is here.
I think that was a lot of good info.
Yeah. I know that's something new. Even, off the pod, I know George and I have talked about it, and that was the first time I've heard of it. I guess in that word. I don't know. We could look up that word later. Maybe you just came up with it.
Maybe I did. I'm the inventor of commune capitalism. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, another thing is I found out there's like a pretty interesting way to track whether or not. So when China does the poverty relief, to find out whether or not the people living in those poor areas are being pushed out, you listen to the dialects that they speak. Because in China, there's one main dialect, which is Mandarin, and it's spoken by spoken by 1.7 billion people in the world or something. And then the next biggest one is the Fujian family of dialects, the Min dialect family, and that's only 80 million people. So the difference between the biggest one to the next biggest is that drastic, and then everything from there on is just smaller and smaller. But the last time I went back to China, cities that when I went to as a kid, cities that used to be poor when I went to as a kid, they were super developed and super flourishing now, and everyone there spoke the local dialect. So that gave me the impression that they weren't being pushed out, because you could only learn the local dialect at home. You can't learn it in school. They only teach Mandarin in school. So if they were to move into the city from other cities, there wouldn't be a way for them to learn the local dialect. So that's how I kind of tested for myself whether or not the government was telling the truth, that people weren't being pushed out. It's that I went to those areas that became developed really fast, and then I looked at how many people would speak the local dialect. And then for example, if you go to Chongqing, which is super, super developed today, everybody there speaks the local dialect. It's but the local dialect in Chongqing is very similar to Mandarin, so I can understand it. But a lot of people there don't even speak Mandarin. That's why I feel like essentially it's kind of like positive gentrification, where the people benefit, not so much like people being pushed out. Yeah, because the government's, it says people are benefiting and people aren't being pushed out. But just the way that I try to judge whether or not they're telling the truth is I just look at how many people speak the local dialect.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, because you can't learn it in school. You can't learn the dialect in school. You only learn Mandarin in school.
Yeah. I had a question for the both of you, and this will apply to me too, and I'll share. Because I know we talked about like the American media propaganda and all that. Because it's so hard to get news about China that's not biased or like Western point of view, especially if you don't know Chinese or you can't read it.
Uh-huh.
I was just curious to know like what type of media or different forms of publication or even podcasts have you've all been kind of looking at instead of like the typical Western mainstream media news source just to get information about China?
Oh, actually, China has an English program. I think it's called CGTN or something. Because I get from my news on China, I get in Chinese. So yeah, that's where I usually get from. But I also know that there's like an English one. I believe it's called CGTN. Yeah, CGTN. And that's from China. But you know, like obviously that news is going to be really biased in favor of China. So you can't only watch that. And then American media is going to be really biased against China. So you kind of have to watch both, I think, and just discern for yourself. And then Russia, I watch a lot of Russian news, RT America, but they're going to be biased in favor of China all the time too. So sometimes I watch some Qatari news. I feel like they're pretty, they don't really have a stake in, I don't know. Do they have a stake in, are they involved with America or China?
I don't know too much about Qatari.
Yeah, I don't know.
No.
But sometimes, yeah, I watch theirs. And I watch, I feel like Singapore news can be pretty good because Singapore isn't really on good terms with either China or America. So it can be good, or you might just see bad things reported on both countries because they kind of don't really, I don't think Singapore really really likes either China or America. Yeah, I have watched like those 5, Russian, Chinese, American, sometimes Qatari and Singaporean. And I just like discern it for myself.
Yeah, I look at all my news comes from like Facebook pages, and I usually get it from like RT. RT's one for sure. There's one called South China Morning Post.
Oh, that's a liberal publication by Hong Kong protesters. Well, like they support the protests. Yeah.
I see. Okay. Yeah. It's very like it's more culture though. I noticed, and it's like really well done. So I don't know. Maybe.
Oh, I feel like if you watch CGTN and South China Morning Post, those two could be like good for balancing each other out.
Okay.
Because the South China Morning Post is very anti-China, and then CGTN is very pro-China because it's by China's government. So like, I feel like watching both of them might give you like like both perspectives.
Yeah. I think for me, I mean all the stuff you guys already mentioned, but I've listened to some of the Carl Zaz podcasts. It's called the Silk and Steel. I think I sent it to you, Carlos. I can send it to you too, George, and I'll put it in the show notes. That one's pretty good because it talks about the history and the culture and politics of China. And he's a person who's fluent in English, but who's also grew up and lived in China. And his views are just, I don't know, it's just interesting because he gives a lot of information that I didn't know about, like Tiananmen Square, like the Silk Road, the relationship with India. And he doesn't really side with, the Western propaganda. And I don't know like what stance he has about like the CCP, but like he has like a direct experience, like when he's describing these things.
Oh, there's also a Colombian YouTuber that I watch. He's from Colombia and he lives in China. Oh, I forgot what his YouTube channel was called. But I also watch him, and there's also this one white guy that lives in China. He uploads like news on YouTube, but both of them are really. I think the Colombian guy's more objective. The white person, the American, he's very pro-China. Like just everything's China's always right. So he's not the best objective source.
That's kind of
like he just fell in love with China. The Colombian guy is pretty. He's pretty good. He'll criticize when it needs to be criticized. So
yeah.
I forgot what his channel is called.
Yeah, we could look it up and put it on the show notes.
Yeah, I think that guy is good.
There was a Canadian guy I started watching, but I forgot his name now. He's on YouTube.
Yeah.
Oh, on YouTube?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of these good news sources are kind of local. Well, not necessarily local, but kind of independent. They're not really funded by like a huge corporation. I mean, some platforms like YouTube. I don't know how many followers they have. I imagine it's not like 1 million, but it's like certain people will gravitate towards it.
Yeah, if they're funded, as soon as they get funded by a corporation, they're going to start becoming biased.
That's true.
They have to.
Yeah.
They have to. Yeah. What's interesting though is like what you see with China is it's going to be very polar. Like you will rarely see neutral news. It's either like someone loves China and the way it's taking kind of creating a new world order, or they hate it and they want the West to win. Like rarely do you see someone in the middle.
Huh.
You know, like if I like I myself, I'm biased too. Like I would, you know, like no one should listen to every single thing I say because I'm going to be biased in China's favor too. Because I like commune capitalism. So if someone doesn't like commune capitalism, you know, maybe like they shouldn't listen to everything I say. Yeah.
Also, another news source that I sent to you, George. I don't know if I sent it to you, Carlos. It's the Chow Collective.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah.
That one was kind of interesting to me because it's a Chinese diaspora collective, and it critiques a lot about the Hong Kong protests and especially about imperialist news from America. And they're very anti-imperialist, and you know they're pro-China, but I don't know if the people there are actually all from China. They might all be from like certain Western countries that are Chinese descent.
Oh, you know, for like those Hong Kong protests, there's actually like video evidence of Steve Bannon directing the protesters on like which buildings to attack. Like, yeah, like him webcamming with them, and then he tells them to attack that building or do this there, do that there, and then there's like evidence of like video evidence and pictures of this one woman. I forgot, she has something to do with Trump or like America's government. Her meeting with all the protesters before it started, and then yeah, so it was like incited by America, I think.
This video and like the information you described, where can you find it?
I see on Chinese media. Let me see if I can find Steve. Let me see if I can find it on Google.
We can look it up because I just want to put it in the show notes, like for these information. And for those of you that are listening, please check out the show notes because we do take the time to do some research and post like the sources and the references we describe. I mean, I know we already passed an hour, but I don't know, George, how was this for you? I know this is the first time you did a podcast. I
enjoyed it. I feel like you might have to edit a lot because I like blanked out a bunch.
That's fine. I enjoy editing. It's not that hard for me. The only time it gets hard is when there's too much sound at one spot. But yeah, it'll be fine.
Yeah, I like. I think there's like a need for a platform like this. Would this be classified as like a radical left platform? Or
I don't know. Actually, Carlos, what do you think?
I don't know. I just know it's for teachers. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I would say I'll speak for myself. I guess I lean more towards the left, and I feel like a lot of the folks that we invited have been more to the left.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think everyone's politics and values are a little bit different, and I know there are a few people that we invited have been more like liberal or neoliberal, but most people have been more to the left. And I think more folks that we invite are critical about imperialism, critical about the establishment, just critical about the education system, and racism, the white supremacy, just things like that. We're very critical about that.
I think where I lean like politically is like kind of like two contradictions, because I like radical left and I like libertarians. Well, I like certain things about both of them, and it kind of resembles what commune capitalism is about, like taking two extremes and merging them, like what works well. So I like certain things about radical left, and I like certain things about libertarianism. And I don't really I'm not really involved with any politics or anything.
I feel like that's kind of how I am. Yeah. Like I'm definitely more, I guess, like you said, like radical left, but then also there's certain like libertarian ideas that I kind of like. Like recently I started following like these groups on Facebook called like the Boogaloo. And they're actually like a libertarian group. So they're like very pro Second Amendment, so like pro gun rights, but then they're also like anti-racist. Sometimes they've actually showed up at like the BLM protests, like some of them. So it's interesting. It's kind of an interesting take on like the like libertarian thought. And it's funny because they're portrayed often as like right wing because they're like pro gun, but then like just being pro gun is really like a libertarian idea. It's not really.
A lot of their values are also left too. Like
right.
They're anti-racist and all
Yeah.
those things.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think pro-gun could be. I mean, because even like leftist revolutionaries,
Yeah,
were
they all had to
pro-gun.
use guns.
Like Che Guevara, Fidel
Yeah.
Castro had to be armed, and I would argue
Yeah.
that people on the left,
Black Panthers had to use it.
yeah, Black Panthers too.
Yeah.
I would argue that people on the left should learn how to use a gun to arm themselves to like
Hmm.
prepare for the
Yeah.
resistance or prepare to overthrow the government. Because without like learning those techniques, everything is just gonna perpetuate and nothing's gonna change.
Yeah, one thing I think about alt-right people is like one thing that I think that they're doing right is they raise their kids to learn wrestling and how to shoot guns. Because that like wrestling is basically you're learning a martial art already, you know.
Yeah.
And then learning how to shoot guns, like if there's ever some kind of civil war, like they have a huge advantage in the fact that most of them already know how to fight and use a gun.
I didn't know about that.
That's kind of because it's part of the culture, wrestling and learning how to use guns, like alt-right people.
I knew about the gun, but I didn't know about the wrestling.
Yeah, they love wrestling.
Greco-Roman wrestling.
Yeah, Greco-Roman and collegiate. They do all forms of wrestling.
Yeah, I guess that's something we gotta learn too. Then.
Yeah.